What if Easter was never meant to exist on its own? What if the resurrection of Jesus wasn't just connected to Passover, but completely dependent on it? Because in the earliest records, it doesn't stand alone. It happens inside a specific moment, on a specific date, within a system that already had meaning. So why was that connection broken? Why take an event tied to a fixed historical moment and turn it into something that moves every year? Because once you change the timing, you don't just change the date, you change the meaning. Picture Easter morning, chocolate eggs, a sunrise service, children in new clothes, a church full of lilies. For most people in the Western world, this is what Easter looks like, a spring celebration of resurrection, loosely tied to some vague sense of renewal. The symbols feel ancient and slightly mysterious. But why rabbits? Why eggs? Why does the date change every year in a way nobody can explain without looking it up? Most people don't ask. The holiday feels complete. It feels like it has always been this way. It hasn't. The celebration most people in the English-speaking world call Easter is in most of the rest of the world, called something entirely different. In French, Pax. In Spanish, Pascua. In Italian, Pasqua. In Greek, Pascha. In Russian, Pascha. Every one of those words descends from a single Hebrew word, Pesach, Passover, the festival that celebrates the liberation of the Hebrew people from slavery in Egypt. The night of the Lamb's blood on the doorposts, the angel of death passing over, the beginning of the Exodus. In most of the world, the Christian celebration never lost that name. In English and German, the name changed to Easter. And with that name change, much of the visible connection to what the event was originally embedded inside quietly disappeared, which raises the question, what exactly happened? When did the connection break? Why? And what changed when it did? The answer isn't just about names, dates, and symbols. It's about what happens to the meaning of an event when you separate it from the story that made it legible. Before we can answer why Easter moved, we need to understand what it was before it moved. And to do that, we need to step into a room. Jerusalem, around 30 CE, the 14th day of the Hebrew month of Nisan. The city has been filling for days, families arriving from across Judea and beyond, all of them here for the same reason. Tonight is Pesach, Passover. Picture the table, a lamb, roasted whole, bitter herbs, horseradish, bitter greens, matzah, flat, unleavened bread, pale and cracker-like. 4 cups of wine, filled and waiting, bowls of salt water, a mixture of apples, nuts, and spices called charosé. And people gathered around the table, parents, children, elders, dressed, according to the custom, as if ready to leave at a moment's notice. Because that is precisely the point. Someone rises and begins to perform the Seder, the Passover ritual. The word Seder means order, because what follows unfolds in a specific, prescribed sequence. Every step has its place. Nothing is improvised. And guiding every step is a text called the Haggadah. Haggadah means the telling, not the recitation, not the reading. The telling, as a living act in the present tense, passed from one generation to the next. And what is being told? The night of the Exodus. The night described in the book of Exodus when the Israelites were slaves in Egypt, and God sent a final plague, the death of the firstborn, that would pass over only the houses of those who had marked their doorposts with the blood of a lamb. The night they fled. The night they were freed. Every element on the table carries that night. The matzah, unleavened bread, is there because there was no time to let the dough rise. The people left in haste, bread half-baked, with no certainty they would survive the night. Every bite of matzah is the taste of urgency, of a people who didn't know yet that they were going to make it. The bitter herbs are there because slavery was bitter, not symbolically, physically, daily, generationally bitter. You eat the bitterness so you don't forget what was endured. The charosé, the sweet paste of apples and nuts, resembles the mortar the slaves used to make bricks, sweetness shaped into the memory of forced labor. The lamb is the sacrifice, the animal whose blood was painted on the doorposts so that death would pass over. Its presence at the table is not decorative. It is the reason the people are alive to sit at this table at all. The Haggadah makes this explicit. Early in the Seder, it states the obligation directly. In every generation, each person is obligated to see themselves as if they personally left Egypt, not as if their ancestors left Egypt. Personally, you, tonight. The Hebrew word zeker, often translated as memory, means something closer to active reenactment. The Passover Seder is not a commemoration from a distance. It is a reliving. You eat the bread of haste because you are the one who fled. You taste the bitterness because you were the one who suffered. You drink from the cup of redemption because you are the one who was freed. This is what Passover was, and is. A fixed date, a specific people, a specific night, an obligation to live it again, every year, in the present tense. So how did we get from a celebration of the Exodus to a celebration of the resurrection of Jesus? The answer begins at another table. Jerusalem, the same city, probably the same week, in the same season, around 30 CE. Another group gathered for the Passover Seder. Jesus of Nazareth, a Jewish teacher from Galilee, is observing Passover with his 12 disciples. The Gospels describe the scene across all 4 accounts. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all place the Last Supper in the context of Passover. Luke describes it most explicitly. When the hour came, he reclined at table, and the apostles with him. And he said to them, I have earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. The lamb, the matzah, the bitter herbs, the 4 cups of wine, same table, same sequence. And then, in the middle of the Seder, Jesus does something that everyone present would have understood immediately. He takes the matzah, the unleavened bread, the bread of haste and flight, and breaks it. This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. He takes the 3rd cup of wine, the cup of redemption, tied to the divine promise, I will redeem you with an outstretched arm, and holds it. This cup that is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood. 2 words stop everything. New covenant. Do this in remembrance of me. The bread of haste is now his body. The cup of redemption is now his blood. The sacrifice whose blood marked the doorposts, the lamb that made liberation possible, is now him. He's not creating a new ritual from nothing. He is redirecting an existing framework at a new referent. Every person at that table knows exactly what these elements mean inside the Passover story. He is placing himself inside that meaning, not alongside it as analogy, but inside it as fulfillment. The lamb of the first Passover pointed toward this one. The liberation from Egypt pointed toward this liberation. The covenant God made with a people he freed from slavery. The new covenant is sealed here, at this table, in this cup, on this night. And then he says it. Do this in remembrance of me. Not in remembrance of the Exodus, of me. Now think about what happens 3 days later. His followers believe he has risen from the dead, and they need to understand what that means. What kind of event is this? What does it accomplish? What does it cost? And for whom? They don't have to build that interpretation from scratch. He already gave them the framework. At the table, the night before he died, the Passover lamb was sacrificed so that death would pass over the people. Its blood marked who was protected. Its death made liberation possible. Jesus died at Passover, and his followers believed he rose. The interpretive move was immediate, and for Jewish followers steeped in the Passover story, almost inevitable. His death functioned like the Passover lambs, a sacrifice that made a new liberation possible. Not liberation from Egypt, liberation from sin and death. The old covenant was between God and the people of Israel. The new covenant in his blood, was now open to everyone. He had told them where to put the resurrection before it even happened, which is why it clicked into the Passover story so completely when it did. The Passover meal now carries a second meaning, laid directly on top of the first. His followers continue to observe Passover, the 14th of Nisan. Same table, same lamb, same bitter herbs, same 4 cups. But they are no longer celebrating only the liberation from Egypt. They are celebrating the one who said he was the final sacrificial lamb, the one who redirected the Seder toward himself and said, "Remember me this way." This is where Easter begins. Not as Easter yet, as Passover, with one new meaning added by the people who had been at that table with Jesus. But what happens when that meaning starts spreading beyond the people who were there, beyond Jerusalem, beyond Judea, into a world that had never heard of Passover? Within decades of the crucifixion, communities of Jesus followers had established themselves in cities across the Roman Empire: Corinth, Ephesus, Rome, Antioch, Alexandria. Most were not Jewish. Greeks, Romans, freed slaves, merchants, people with no ancestral connection to the Exodus, no familiarity with the Hebrew calendar, no lived experience of the Passover framework that gave the resurrection story its meaning. They had joined a movement. They believed Jesus had risen. They observed his death and resurrection annually, but they were doing it without the framework, and that created an immediate practical problem. When exactly do you observe it? The earliest Jewish followers kept the name and the date. In Greek, they called their observance Pascha, a direct transliteration of the Hebrew Pesach. Same word, same date, the 14th of Nisan, every year, regardless of what day of the week it fell on. To them, this was obvious. The event happened at Passover. You observe it at Passover. The resurrection only carries its full weight when read through the Passover framework. The lamb, the liberation, the covenant, the blood that marks who belongs to the story. Change the date, and you're not just changing the calendar. You're untethering the event from the story that explains what it means. But the non-Jewish communities had a different logic entirely. Every Sunday, they already gathered to celebrate the resurrection, the first day of the week, the day Christ had risen. Sunday was the weekly rhythm of Christian worship. So for communities with no connection to the Hebrew calendar, anchoring the annual observance to a Sunday made far more sense than anchoring it to a date in a Jewish festival they'd never observed. And here's where something subtle but consequential begins. When the non-Jewish communities moved the observance to a Sunday, they weren't just changing the day. They were changing the question the observance was answering. The communities observing on the 14th of Nisan, known as the Quartodecimans, from the Latin for 14, were answering, when did this happen? At Passover, inside the framework, the lamb, the blood, the liberation. The Sunday communities were answering a different question. What does this mean for us now? Resurrection, new life, available to everyone. Every year, on the day he rose. Both questions are real, but they lead to different observances, and underneath them, a deeper pressure was building. The Jewish-Roman wars had been catastrophic. Jerusalem destroyed in 70 CE. The Jewish population of Judea decimated after the Bar Kokhba revolt in 135 CE. Being visibly associated with Judaism in the Roman Empire now carried real political danger. This pressure worked differently on different communities. For the non-Jewish converts, Greeks, Romans, freed slaves who had never observed Passover to begin with, the 14th of Nisan was simply foreign. It meant nothing to them. Anchoring the most important Christian observance to a date in a Jewish calendar they had no relationship to felt arbitrary at best, alienating at worst. For the Jewish followers within the movement, those who understood exactly what the 14th of Nisan meant, the pressure was sharper and more personal. Some communities that had begun as Jewish were now actively trying to establish themselves as something distinct from Judaism. For them, keeping the Passover date wasn't just inconvenient. It was a liability, an anchor to an identity they were trying to leave behind. The calendar was never just a scheduling question. It was an identity statement. And by the late 2nd century, the tension had become impossible to ignore. Around 190 CE, Victor I, the Bishop of Rome, attempted to excommunicate the churches of Asia Minor, the Quartodecimans, for refusing to abandon the 14th of Nisan. Polycrates, the Bishop of Ephesus, wrote back. His letter has survived. Its tone is quiet and immovable. He lists the figures of his tradition who observed the 14th of Nisan: Philip the Apostle, John who lay on the Lord's breast at the Last Supper, Polycarp of Smyrna. All of them, he says, kept the 14th day, deviating in no respect. Then he adds, I could mention the bishops who were present. If I were to write their names, the names would be many. He is saying, this is what was handed down from the people who were there, and you are not going to change it. Victor backed down, but the pressure didn't stop. To observe Pascha on Passover's date was to remain, visibly, inside the Jewish story. To move it to a Sunday, calculated independently of the Jewish calendar, was to say, we are something separate. We have our own time, our own story. The name hadn't changed. Communities everywhere still called it Pascha, but the framework underneath was splitting in two. And the moment that split became law, enforced by an emperor with an empire to hold together, was still a century and a half away. The year is 325 CE. Constantine has summoned bishops from across the Roman Empire to a council at Nicaea. The primary business is a theological dispute fracturing the church. But while the bishops are assembled, they settle a secondary matter that has caused friction for over a century: the date of Pascha. Constantine wanted uniformity, not primarily for theological reasons, but for political ones. A fractured church meant a fractured empire. The religion he'd embraced as a unifying force was embarrassingly disunified on the date of its central celebration. City by city, province by province, the most important Christian feast was observed on different days. To unify belief, the system first had to unify time. The council established a universal rule. Pascha would be observed on the first Sunday after the first full moon after the spring equinox. One rule, for everyone, simultaneously across the empire. But the council didn't just change the date. It explained the change in terms worth examining carefully. Constantine's letter to the churches after the council, preserved by the historian Eusebius of Caesarea, is explicit. He describes following the Jewish calendar as shameful. He argues it's inappropriate for Christians to follow the customs of those who killed Christ. And then he reaches for a word that stops the argument entirely. It appeared an unworthy thing, Constantine wrote, that in the celebration of this most holy feast, we should follow the practice of the Jews. Unworthy, not inconvenient, not impractical, not technically incorrect. Unworthy. He isn't arguing the Jewish calendar is flawed. He's arguing that dependence on it is beneath the dignity of the new faith, that following it represents a theological subordination Christianity must overcome. And then he goes further. Having declared Jewish practice unworthy, he frames the abandonment of it as an act of power, not of loss. He writes that, we have it in our power, if we abandon their custom, to prolong the due observance of this ordinance to future ages by a truer order. A truer order. He's not just breaking from the Jewish calendar. He's claiming that the break produces something better, a purer, more correct observance, one that has been in the Church's possession since the Passion itself. The irony is embedded in his own language. He's asserting Christianity's independence from the Passover framework by claiming a truer connection to the events Passover commemorated. We don't need their calendar, he is saying, because we have always had the real thing. He has taken the logic of the Passover story. This is the truer liberation. This is the genuine covenant, and turned it against Passover itself. The break was now official. The calculation was assigned to the Bishop of Alexandria, who would determine the date each year and communicate it to the rest of the church. Control over Pascha was centralized. The bishop who announced the date told the entire Christian world when to observe its most important feast. Control over sacred time became institutional power. But why does the date keep changing? Here's something most people have wondered and never gotten a satisfying answer to. Christmas is December 25th, every year. Fixed. You know exactly when it's coming months in advance. You can plan around it without checking. Easter is different. Some years it's in late March. Some years it stretches into late April. This year it falls on one date. Next year it could be 5 weeks earlier or later. Nobody can remember it without looking it up. And even when they look it up, the explanation they usually get is vague. It depends on the moon, which is technically true. But why? Why would a Christian holiday depend on the moon at all? And why is the calculation complicated enough that the date can swing across a 35-day window? The answer starts with a problem that sounds simple until you try to solve it. Imagine you want to keep a festival in the same season every year. Spring, say. You want it to always arrive in spring, never drifting into winter, never sliding into summer. If your calendar is based on the sun, that's easy. The solar calendar, the one most of the modern world uses, tracks the Earth's journey around the sun. 1 year equals 1 orbit. The seasons fall in the same position every year. Fix your festival to a date, and it stays in spring forever. December 25th. Every year. No drift. But the Hebrew calendar isn't solar. It's lunar. Months follow the cycle of the moon, roughly 29.5 days each. 12 lunar months add up to about 354 days, which is 11 days shorter than a solar year. 11 days. Every year. That gap accumulates. Left uncorrected, a spring festival in a purely lunar calendar drifts backward through the seasons. Spring one decade, winter the next, autumn after that. To prevent this, the Hebrew calendar periodically inserts an extra month into specific years, resetting the alignment. The result is a calendar that stays lunar in its rhythms, but always keeps Passover in spring, on the first full moon after the spring equinox, in the month of Nisan. The Council of Nicaea, trying to place Easter in the same season as Passover while being independent of the Jewish calendar, had to solve the same problem. How do you reliably land in spring on a date tied to the lunar cycle without using the Hebrew calendar? Their answer, the rule established at Nicaea, the first Sunday after the first full spring moon. But to make that calculation work consistently, to predict it years in advance, and prevent it from drifting across the seasons, they needed to track the relationship between solar years and lunar cycles, which requires the same underlying mathematics the Hebrew calendar uses. The result is a date that can fall anywhere within a 35-day window, from March 22nd to April 25th, depending on where a given year sits in the intersection of solar and lunar cycles. In practice, this means that in 2019, for example, the astronomical full moon and the astronomical equinox both fell on March 20th. By any natural reading, Easter should have been March 24th. But the Church's fixed equinox was March 21st, 1 day later, which meant the full moon technically preceded it. The calculation skipped to the next full moon in April. Easter that year was April 21st, nearly a month later than the sky suggested. This is why Easter moves, not by accident, not by oversight, because it was built on a tension between two calendar systems that don't naturally align, and the only way to resolve that tension was to build a calculation complex enough to track both, which raises a question worth sitting with. Why not just fix it? Why not pick a date, the second Sunday of April, say, and be done with it? Other holidays manage it. Why does Easter still follow the moon? Here's something worth actually trying. Open a calendar, find Easter this year, now find Passover. Look at how close they are. Not occasionally close, not coincidentally close in certain years. Consistently, persistently close, year after year, across centuries. The two festivals orbit each other like they're still attached. Sometimes the same week, sometimes overlapping entirely, occasionally separated by more, but always in the same season, always within proximity. This is not a coincidence. It is a consequence of something that was never resolved. Start with the name the Church uses for its own Easter calculation: the Paschal full moon, the Paschal tables. The word Paschal, used in Christian liturgy, Christian calendar mathematics, Christian theological language, comes from Pascha, which comes from Pesach. The very technical vocabulary of Easter's calculation still contains the Hebrew word for Passover, but the dependency goes deeper than vocabulary. The 14th of Nisan, Passover, falls on the first full moon after the spring equinox. That is how the Hebrew calendar locates it, every year. Now look at the Nicaea rule. They are looking for the same thing in the sky. Easter is Passover plus one Sunday, not as a metaphor, not as a theological claim, as mathematics. The Church's calculation and the Hebrew calendar's calculation are tracking the same astronomical event. One stops at the full moon, the other waits for the Sunday after it. What this means is that the separation Constantine declared, the separation he framed as freeing Christianity from an unworthy dependence, was never mathematically complete. The Church couldn't simply choose an arbitrary date for Easter. It needed to stay in the same season as Passover, because the crucifixion happened at Passover, and everyone knew it. The theological connection couldn't be severed without making Easter meaningless. But it also couldn't acknowledge that connection directly. Not after Constantine's letter, not after centuries of institutional distance from the Jewish calendar. So it created an elaborate calculation that does exactly what the Hebrew calendar does. It follows the moon. Different name, different tables, different institution producing the number. Same moon. But if the calculation never really separated from Passover, what about the name? In French, Spanish, Italian, Greek, Russian, the word for the Christian celebration is still Pascha, 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 still Passover, in every language that kept the ancient name. But Pascha, the word that still carried Pesach inside it, gradually gave way, in the Germanic and Anglo-Saxon world, to a new name, Easter, a word with no connection to Exodus, to liberation, to the 14th of Nisan. So where did it come from? Every spring, as reliably as the season itself, a particular claim circulates across social media. You've probably seen it. Easter was originally the celebration of Ishtar, the Babylonian goddess of fertility and sex. Her symbols, the egg and the bunny, are fertility symbols. At its roots, Easter is all about Ishtar. It spreads every year. Millions of shares. Presented as the hidden truth about Easter that the Church suppressed. The ancient pagan origin that Christianity tried to erase. There's one significant problem. It isn't true. And the story of how it became so widely believed is itself a perfect illustration of what this video is actually about. How the meaning of Easter has been constructed, reshaped, and recirculated for purposes that have nothing to do with historical accuracy. Let's follow this claim back to its source. The origin isn't ancient. It isn't archaeological. It isn't from any scholar of Mesopotamian religion or early Christian history. It comes from a book published in 1853. The Two Babylons was written by Alexander Hislop, a minister in the Free Church of Scotland. His project was theological and polemical. He wanted to demonstrate that the Roman Catholic Church had absorbed the practices of ancient Babylon, that it was, in his reading of the Book of Revelation, the whore of Babylon. His method was to find similarities between Catholic practices and ancient Mesopotamian religion, and declare them connected. His evidence for the Easter-Ishtar connection was this. The name sounded similar to him in English. That was it. He heard Easter and Ishtar and concluded they must share an origin. Linguists have since established that the two words are completely unrelated. The phonetic similarity Hislop relied on is what linguists call a false cognate, two words that happen to sound alike in one language but share no actual relationship. Hislop's book was criticized by scholars from the outset, but remained influential in Protestant anti-Catholic circles for decades. Read by exactly the audience it was written for, ignored by everyone else. Then, in 2012, someone turned its central claim into a meme, a shareable image, a punchy paragraph. Easter is Ishtar. The Church doesn't want you to know. And it went viral in a way that no academic correction ever could. By 2019, it had been shared tens of millions of times. It became one of the most widely circulated claims about Easter in the English-speaking world, not because the evidence improved, but because the format was perfect for the medium. Short, provocative, flattering to the reader. You're smart enough to see what they've been hiding. So if not Ishtar, where does the name actually come from? The closest answer we have comes from the monk Bede, writing in 725 CE. He records that the Germanic month of Eosterminath, roughly equivalent to April, was named after a goddess called Eostre, in whose honor feasts were once celebrated. Easter derives from that name, traced back through Old English and Proto-Germanic roots associated with the dawn or the east. Ishtar is an Akkadian name from an entirely separate language family, with no etymological connection to English or German. The two words simply happen to sound similar, a coincidence that, in Hislop's hands, became a conspiracy. Easter herself remains shadowy, a single passage in Bede, no shrines, no other ancient sources, no corroborating evidence. Some scholars accept it as plausible. Why would a Christian monk invent a pagan detail? Others remain skeptical. What's not in doubt is that the name Easter severs the last visible linguistic thread to the original festival. In every other major language, the word still means Passover. In English, it became something else entirely. Now step back and look at what just happened. This video is tracing how Easter's meaning was reshaped over centuries, by the Council of Nicaea, by the name change, by the separation from Passover. Each reshaping served a purpose. Constantine needed a unified empire. The Germanic missionaries needed a name that fit their world. And Alexander Hislop needed ammunition against the Catholic Church. The Ishtar myth is not an ancient discovery. It's a 19th century polemical construction that the internet accidentally revived. Someone needed a particular story about Easter's origins. They assembled it from available materials, a superficial phonetic similarity, a plausible-sounding claim, an anti-establishment framing. It spread because it was useful, because it told people something they wanted to believe. The reshaping of Easter's meaning didn't stop at Nicaea. It never stopped. Now, what about the genuine pre-Christian layer? The eggs, the rabbits, the spring imagery? Here the picture is more interesting and more honest than the Ishtar story allows. Spring renewal symbolism is one of the most widely distributed patterns in human culture, not because ancient peoples were all connected to a single source, but because spring is spring. Every culture that experienced winter experienced the same thing. Life withdrawing, the world going cold and bare, and then, reliably, cyclically, returning. Seeds germinating, animals giving birth, days lengthening. The psychological force of that return is universal. Of course, it generated ritual. Eggs appear as symbols of new life across ancient Egyptian cosmology, Finnish creation mythology, Persian Nowruz celebrations, and Central Asian traditions. None of them connected to each other, all of them independently drawn to the same image. A sealed object containing hidden life, the appearance of inertness concealing the reality of potential. It's one of the most natural symbols the human imagination has ever produced. Rabbits, associated with spring, fertility, and abundance, appear across pre-Christian European folk traditions, not as Ishtar's companions, simply as creatures that breed visibly and prolifically as the season warms. When Christianity moved through Germanic and Anglo-Saxon cultures in the early medieval period, it absorbed their spring observances and gave them new meaning within a new story. This was deliberate strategy. Pope Gregory I, writing in 601 CE, instructed missionaries not to destroy the sacred sites of the peoples they were converting, but to rededicate them, to take what was already meaningful and redirect it, rather than replace it entirely. The same logic applied to symbols. Eggs that had meant natural renewal now meant resurrection. Hares that had meant spring abundance now appeared in Easter imagery. Spring that had meant the return of the seasons now meant the return of a specific person from death. The symbols didn't originate with Easter, but they weren't stolen from Ishtar either. They arrived through the ordinary process of a religion adapting to the cultures it enters, each culture adding its own layer to a celebration that had been accumulating layers since Passover, which is the thread this whole investigation has been pulling. Every layer of Easter, Passover, Nicaea, the name change, the spring symbolism, the Ishtar myth, is an example of the same thing, meaning being reshaped. The same event reframed for a new audience, a new purpose, a new world. And through all of it, beneath the name change, beneath the meme, beneath the spring eggs and the chocolate, something has been running that no reshaping could reach. Not in the calendar, in the story itself. When Christianity separated from Passover, it didn't just change a date. It changed what kind of thing Easter was. Passover is a historical event. It commemorates a specific night, a specific people, a specific liberation. The Haggadah insists on that specificity at every turn. The bitter herbs, the unleavened bread, the obligation to experience yourself as personally present, not a descendant remembering, a participant reliving. Easter became something structurally different. Picture the rhythm of the Christian year as it developed across the centuries following Nicaea. Advent, Christmas, Lent, Easter, Pentecost. The same sequence, every year, in every church across the empire and beyond. Death and resurrection observed annually, embedded in a cycle that repeats as reliably as the seasons themselves. Passover says, "This happened to us on this night. Remember it." Easter says, "This happens every year to everyone." Again, one is a memory, the other is a rhythm. And that difference transforms who the event belongs to and what it means. And here's the part of this story that is almost never told. When Christianity separated from Passover, both traditions were changed simultaneously. Picture the Jewish world in the decades following the destruction of the Temple in 70 CE. Jerusalem in ruins. The Temple, the center of Jewish religious life, the place where the Passover sacrifice was performed, gone. The rabbinical scholars who survived were left with an urgent problem. How do you preserve a tradition built around practices that can no longer be performed? Their answer was to write it down. The Mishnah, the written compilation of Jewish oral law and practice, completed around 200 CE, codified how Jewish life was to be observed in the absence of the temple. And as part of that codification, the rabbis were shaping the Haggadah into the form it still takes today. They were doing this in a world where the Passover story was being read in two incompatible directions at once. The Christian reading had universalized it. The Passover lamb pointed beyond the Exodus, beyond the Jewish people, toward a cosmic redemption available to all of humanity. The particular liberation had become a metaphor for a universal one. The rabbinical response was to insist, with precision and deliberateness, on the particular. This happened to us, not to humanity in general, not as a symbol pointing elsewhere, to the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. To these people, on this night, the liberation, the covenant is specific. The memory belongs to a specific community. The Haggadah's most famous moment, the youngest child asking, "Why is this night different from all other nights?" was being sharpened in a world where an influential reading was arguing that this night was, in fact, not unique at all, that it pointed toward a night available to everyone, every year, in every season. The insistence on particularity was the response. Two communities, reading the same foundational story in incompatible ways, now observing it on different dates, with different meanings, the original connection increasingly invisible to both. What Christianity gained in this separation was real universality, a story available to anyone regardless of background, language, or ancestry. The resurrection as new life, hope, salvation, able to travel across cultures and centuries, absorbing new symbols and new languages wherever it went. What it cost was equally real. The specific anchor, the particular people, and this is the detail the whole investigation has been building toward. The theological coherence the Passover connection provided for free. Think about what the resurrection story actually requires to carry its full weight. A sacrifice. But what kind of sacrifice? And what does it accomplish? A liberation. But liberation from what and for whom? A covenant renewed in blood. But whose covenant? And what were its original terms? Inside the Passover framework, those questions already had answers. Jesus didn't need to explain them at the Last Supper. Everyone at the table already knew. The Haggadah had been running for centuries. He was speaking lines that already existed and pointing them somewhere new. Outside the framework, those questions required answers that had to be built from scratch. What kind of sacrifice is this, if not the Passover lamb? What is the liberation, if not the Exodus? Centuries of Christian theology have wrestled with precisely these questions, atonement theory, covenant theology, the meaning of the Eucharist, producing answers that are sophisticated, serious, and still debated. The Passover framework answered them before they were asked, which means the dependency was never just about the calendar. It was about the story underneath the calendar. We started with a simple question: why does Easter move? And found an answer that goes much further than dates. Easter began as Passover, not alongside it, not inspired by it, but inside it. What followed was a long process of separation. First gradual, communities spreading beyond Jewish populations, observing Pascha without the Passover framework that gave it its meaning. Then contested, the Quartodecimans holding to the 14th of Nisan, while Sunday communities drifted away. Then institutional, Constantine declaring the connection unworthy and imposing a new date. And then, 17 centuries later, a Protestant minister in 1853 inventing a false origin for Easter to use against Catholics. His argument forgotten, then resurrected as a viral meme. The reshaping continuing, as it always had, for purposes unrelated to what actually happened. But underneath all of it, two things remained: the moon and the framework. The same astronomical event, the first full moon after the spring equinox, has been anchoring both Passover and Easter since the separation was declared complete. The Church renamed it, built new tables around it, assigned new authorities to calculate it, and still followed it. And the framework, the Passover story, the lamb, the liberation, the blood of the covenant, is still doing theological work inside Easter, still shaping the meaning of sacrifice and redemption in language that was formed around a specific night in Egypt, centuries before the resurrection. You can change the name, you can change the date. You can change who observes it, where, in what language, with what symbols, but you cannot change what the event meant to the people who were there when it happened, and you cannot change the sky. So the question this investigation leaves open isn't really about Easter. It's about what happens when any system tries to sever itself from its own origins. How much can you rename, recalculate, and reframe before the foundation shows through? If this shifted something, leave a like and subscribe for what comes next. Until then, keep questioning.